Last time we spoke about the first land battles of the First Sino-Japanese War, the battles of Sangwon and Pyongyang. The Qing's plan to perform a pincer attack from the north and south of Korea was smashed when they lost Asan. However, not all was lost. They still held the extremely formidable defensive position at Pyongyang, with some of their very best units and best equipment. The Japanese First Army deceived the Qing defenders and made an incredible victory at Pyongyang, sending the remaining survivors fleeing towards the Yalu River. It was a tremendous blow to the Chinese, despite their home press proclaiming every event to be a victory. Now the Qing had their backs against the wall along the Yalu River. If the Japanese were to take it, they could march right into Manchuria. Will the Qing be able to rally themselves and hold the Japanese within Korea, or will this war see action within their borders? This episode is the First Sino-Japanese War Part 3, the Battle of the Yalu River. Welcome back to the Fall and Rise of China podcast. I'm your dutiful host, Craig Watson. But before we can begin, I just want to remind you all, this podcast is only made possible through the efforts of Kings and Generals over at YouTube. Perhaps you want to learn a bit more about the history of Asia? Kings and Generals has an assortment of episodes on the history of Asia and much, much more. So go give them a look over at YouTube. So please, subscribe to Kings and Generals over at YouTube and continue to help us produce this content by checking out www.patreon.com/kingsandgenerals. And hey, don't forget about our sister podcast over at the Pacific War Week by Week podcast, written and narrated by me. And if after all that you are still hungry for some more history, why don't you check out my personal channel, the Pacific War channel, over at YouTube. Over there I have just unleashed my episode on Chang Song Chang, the dog meat general, the monster behind the meme. Also, just a friendly reminder, I now myself have a Patreon account, which can be found at www.patreon.com/thepacificwarchannel. And this month's exclusive podcast over there is part 3 of my series about General Ishiwara Kanji, the mastermind behind the Mukden incident and the author behind the final war theory. Check it out, it would mean a lot to me. Literally a day after the Battle of Pyongyang, the second major battle of the entire war took place. The IJN had been trying to engage a very reluctant Ching Navy, who were under orders not to cross the Yalu Weihawei line. Well, the Japanese crossed it for them. The Beiyang fleet had difficulties operating in the open sea, where the IJN warships held an advantage in speed and better maintenance. The Beiyang fleet thus operated more so along the coastlines, with her 2 colossal German-built battleships, the Dingyuan and Tianyuan, only capable of hitting 15 to 16 knot speed. To give a comparison, the IJN ships had a rough average speed of 20 knots. Now, in early September, Li Hangjiang decided to reinforce the Qing forces at Pyongyang, and he had his Beiyang fleet escort their transports to the mouth of the Daetong River. On September the 12th, around 4,500 Qing troops had left Daegu, aboard 5 transports heading for Dalian, where they would be joined by another 2,000 more troops. Admiral Ding initially wanted to send the transports with only a light escort, keeping the bulk of the Beiyang fleet in a safer position just in case the IJN combined fleet offered battle. However, reports of sightings of the Japanese cruisers Yoshino and Nanawa, who were performing reconnaissance near Weihaiwei, led to disaster for the Qing. The Beiyang fleet commanders took these reports to indicate the IJN combined fleet were all around Weihaiwei, and it just so happened the entire Beiyang fleet was to head to Weihaiwei on the 13th. The Qing hunted down the cruisers for an entire day, but they found no sight of them, so Admiral Ding turned back to Dalian, arriving on the 15th. The Japanese victory at Pyongyang meant the Qing land forces were concentrating at the Yalu River. Reports began to reach Admiral Ding about the supposed grand victory, but he read between the lines, figuring out the truth of the matter when the reports also stated that the transports for further troops to the mouth of the Daetong River were no longer necessary. Admiral Ding surmised correctly that the Qing line of defense would now be established on the Yalu River, so he decided to bring the troops there instead. At around 1 a.m. on the 16th, the Beiyang fleet and the 5 transports departed Dalian Bay. The Beiyang fleet consisted of the 2 ironclad battleships, the Qingyuan and the Zhenyuan, a smaller coastal defense battleship called the Pingyuan, the cruisers Layuan, Ziyuan, Qingyuan, Qingyuan, and yes, those last 2 sound extremely similar, Juyuan, and the small cruisers, Chaoyong, Guanjia, Yangwei, and the gunboats, Guangbing, Jiannan, Jianzhong, Fulong, and Zhouwan. And now at this point, I really need to take a moment here to explain a lot about the two opposing naval forces. These Qing ships I just listed, for example, most of them were built before 1887. But for the Japanese, the majority of their ships would be built after 1890. About 10 significant ships from each side would take part in the upcoming battle. For the Qing, the two battleships would each be holding 1/3 more displacement than the largest Japanese warship. The Qing warships could only go as fast as their slowest, and the two colossal battleships only pulled, like I said, 15 or so knots, meaning the IJN would enjoy a massive advantage in speed. The armaments of the Beiyang fleet were created mostly out of the Jingyan and the Fuzhou shipyards, and they were by far and large superior to that of the Japanese. They had foreign expertise overlooking the developments. But because of the nature of the Ching Navy, this did not extend to the maintenance for the ships. Qing regional leaders were very skeptical of Li Hangjiang and the Naval Board, and they refused to pay anything more than the very bare minimum required for the basic maintenance of their navies. Many of these regional leaders were not too happy about the Naval Board having its director being the Manchu Prince Chun, the successor of Manchu Prince Qing. Why were they not too happy, you might ask? Well, other than the regular ethnic rivalries, neither Manchu director could administer funds properly, nor prevent Empress Dowager Cixi from allegedly diverting funds for other purposes. Now, hold on to a minute for all of those who might be screaming, that's just a myth. I will get to that later. A lot of rumors sprang up that the Empress Dowager had embezzled funds from the Navy to restore the old summer palace. This is infamous to anyone who learns 19th century Chinese history. In fact, as the story goes, Cixi had rebuilt the expensive marble boat in the palace garden with funds that were earmarked for modernizing the Navy. It is alleged Cixi devoted 100 million taels to the purpose of rebuilding the summer palace, and the Qing Navy would not see additional funding after the year 1889. Some estimate the summer palace renovations took 11 million taels from the naval funds, enough to buy around 6 to 7 warships. To be honest, I am a huge fan of the podcast called Our Fake History, and I hope he tackles this myth one day, because it's a lot more complicated than one would think. But to clarify, it seems Empress Dowager Cixi was not wholly at fault for the decline of the Qing Navy. No, it seems Emperor Guangxu's, quote, lack of interest in developing and maintaining the military was to blame. Grand Tutor Wang Tonghe advised Emperor Guangxu to cut all funding to the Navy and Army because he did not see Japan as a true threat. And during the 1890s, large natural disasters occurred which seemed a much more pressing issue to allocate funds to. And let's be honest, most of China's most horrific rebellions occur as a result of natural disasters. The Taiping Rebellion was just 15 minutes ago. So, could you blame the emperor on this one? Regardless, it's just to say it's not so black and white. There were numerous variables at play when it came to the funding scandals. But as a Chinese friend of mine once put it when I was telling him about what I was writing about, everyone learns about Cixi embezzling for the palace at the cost of the Navy. So certainly in the minds of, even today, anyone from modern-day China that knows a little bit about their history, it's certainly the prevailing idea that it's all Empress Dowager Cixi's fault. And I'm not trying to take the blame off her. She definitely is to blame for so many problems in this time period. I mean, she really is the conservative bulwark force stopping any modernization. Pretty sure I made a note of this in this series about the time they approached her about building a railway line. And she said she didn't want it because she thought that it would be too noisy and it would wake up their ancestors. But she tried to compromise with the progressives. She said, instead of having the train carts pulling all of those carts, why don't we just have horses draw it? It would be quieter. Empress Dowager Cixi. Yep. Li Hangjiang's ordnance supply officer for the Beiyang fleet was his son-in-law, Zhang Peiduan, who was referred to by Professor William Lockwood as, quote, the champion swindler. And for someone to give you that kind of nickname in the Qing dynasty, the late Qing dynasty, when it is notably so corrupt that you couldn't find a single official who wasn't embezzling, that must mean he was the king of embezzlers. Professor William Lockwood described the man to be so corrupt that sailors would often find shells filled with sand and, quote, when the shooting began, the Chinese fleet found that its total supply of ammunition amounted to 14 shells per gun. 2 7-ton ironclads had only 3 shells in all of their 10-inch guns. There is zero question on the issue of corruption when it came to the Qing Navy in the late 19th century. They were critically hampered with shortages of ammunition, and there are even reports some shells were filled with cement rather than explosives. Not only would the Qing sailors find little shells to fire during the Battle of the Yalu, imagine the lack of practice as a result of never having ammunition. Yes, the Beiyang officers were told that they couldn't allow their men to train in gunnery very much because they simply could not afford the shells. Thus, poor accuracy and seriously questionable naval orders during the battle would plague the Beiyang fleet. Alongside the lack of ammo, it is also alleged the Qing warships had half of their crews on board because of salary embezzlement. Quite a while back in the series, I did talk about an ongoing issue when commanders would say that they had more troops than they did just to receive more funds. That is that kind of situation here. Honestly, it reminds me of the days I was working in the restaurant business and they would just understaff us to save money. So the Beiyang fleet would come into battle undermanned, undertrained, and under-equipped. The recipe for disaster. I always find it kind of comical that on top of all of that, their signal books that were issued to every single ship were all written in English, a language that most of the officers could not speak nor read. Now, as for the Japanese, the IJN Combined Fleet consisted of 2 formations, the Flying Squadron, composed of the 4 fast cruisers Yoshino, Takachiho, Akitsushima, and the Nanawa, led by Admiral Tsuboi Kozo. And then there was the main fleet, consisting of the cruiser and flagship Matsushima, followed by Chiyoda, Itsukushima, Hashidate, and the ironclads Fuso and Heioi, led by Admiral Ito Sekiyuki. There was also 2 dispatch vessels, the Seikayo Maru, led by the Swedish-born Captain John Wilson, and the gunboat Akagi. Now, unlike the Beiyang fleet, which was one of the 4 non-cooperating fleets that made up the Qing Navy, the IJN Combined Fleet were consolidated under a single command, always unified, trained extensively together, and as a single fighting force. Although many of the Qing ships had more armor, they were slower, and the Japanese specifically trained using the Jin Decote strategy, emphasizing speed and quick-firing guns to overcome larger opponents. Now, to try and take this into terms some of my viewers who might play World of Warships would understand, the Jin Decote strategy was designed by the French specifically to defeat the British Royal Navy at the time. So as all of you are probably aware, the British Royal Navy was immense. The French could not possibly build a comparable navy to fight such a thing. The British relied on ironclad giant battleships. So it got the French to thinking, how could we specifically target those battleships? What could we design that could beat them? The French could not simply pour money into building their own giant ironclad battleships. So instead, they just built faster, mobile gunboats and cruisers. Their whole idea was to put strong armaments on these faster, though weaker ships when it comes to armor, and to just try and glass cannon it. Fire upon these ironclads with no mercy, and try and go faster than them so you don't get hit in the process. If you can build, let's say, 2 cruisers or 4 destroyers for the price of 1 ironclad battleship, well, with these 4 vessels or 2 vessels firing upon one, chances were you could probably just, defeat those ironclad battleships just by numerical superiority. Thus, when all the way back, when the Beiyang fleet made their little sortie to Nagasaki and the Japanese saw these giant behemoths, they were thinking the same thing. Let's adopt what the French did with the British. And it's going to win them this battle. The Qing's ironclads had short barrels as main armaments, meaning their shells had low muzzle velocity, resulting in poor penetration and terrible accuracy, especially at long range, which they never should be firing at anyways. Although the Qing sailors were well drilled, they had practically no gunnery practice as a result of having no ammunition to work with. The lack of training in gunnery, in combination to not having many shells to fight with, or having the wrong caliber shells on certain ships, and literally finding out that some of said shells might be filled with cement or porcelain, would lead to disaster. Aboard the Jingyuan was U.S. Naval Advisor Philo McGiffin, who went on the record saying this: "Many of the gunpowder charges were 13 years old and condemned." So yes, even the gunpowder was seeing embezzlement issues. Sadly, Li Hangzheng had tried to delay a naval battle against the Japanese specifically to give his fleet more time to equip their ships with additional ammunition. But the Qing Imperial Court deemed this cowardice, and they forced his hand to press on. In the end, the Qing fleet was bigger and armed with bigger guns, but the Japanese would be faster and capable of firing their smaller guns much more so and much more accurately. Admiral Ding's Beiyang fleet reached the mouth of the Yalu River at around 2 p.m. The transports, escorted by 5 warships, the Jian'an, Jianchong, Guangbing, Pingyuan, and a torpedo boat, landed the troops until the morning of the 17th. Meanwhile, the other Beiyang ships anchored in some shallow waters around 8 nautical miles southwest of the mouth of the Yalu River. At 9:20 a.m. on the 17th, the fleet conducted a training exercise lasting for about an hour and a half, before returning to their anchorage. But then, soon after, at around 11:28 a.m., observers aboard the Qing warships began to spot smoke coming from the southwest. Admiral Ding attempted to form his fleet into a southward-facing line abreast using his 2 battleships in the center. In the line going from left to right were the Guangjia, Jingyuan, Qiyuan, Jieyuan, Lieyuan, Jingyuan, Yanghui, and the Chaoyong. Another group of 4 ships led by the slow-moving Pingyuan were escorting the transports upriver, and they were forced to try and catch up, which they would around 2:30. Late in the morning, the 2 fleets began approaching another in very different formations. The Qing were trying to uphold their line abreast, but there was an enormous confusion in signals, no doubt to the fact that all of their signal books were written in English, and as I said, very few of the officers could speak or were even familiar with English. Added to this was the differing speeds of the various warships. Thus, they all ended up in an asymmetrical kind of wedge formation with the 2 battleships at the fore and the other vessels trailing behind on the 2 flanks. According to various accounts, there was a consensus that the formation was done in great disorder. In fact, it may not have been a deliberate formation, but rather the order in which the warships simply found themselves as they were trying to form a line abreast. And by the way, for the formation known as a line abreast, what you do not want to do when you're performing this is you do not want to keep your weaker ships on the flanks because it makes them vulnerable. The whole point is actually to keep your stronger ships on the flanks. But the Chinese here have done the very opposite of that. Their 2 ironclad battleships are in the middle, and their weakest ships are on the furthest ends of their flanks. As for the IJN Combined Fleet, they were approaching in a single column formation with the flying squadron in the front, followed by the main squadron. The order of the ships for the line in the Japanese was the first and fastest protected cruisers Yoshino, Nanawa, Takachiho, and the Akitsushima, and this was followed by the flagship Matsushima alongside her 2 sisters, followed by the Chiyoda, Fuso, Heioi, Akagi, and at the very end, the Sakyomaru. With the Beiyang fleet in sight, Admiral Sugiyuki gave orders for the flying squadron to attack the Chinese right flank, hoping to annihilate their weaker boats at the end of their formation. Upon seeing the flying squadron's maneuvers, Admiral Ding ordered his ships to change course in such a way that it would have exposed his flagship, the Jingyuan, but put the rest of his squadron in a good position to fire upon the Japanese. However, Admiral Ding's captain aboard the Jingyuan ignored the order, allegedly out of cowardice, and instead he ordered the Jingyuan to fire its main guns well before the Japanese were even within range. The order to fire apparently caused great confusion amongst the other ships, seeing the Chinese right flank firing into a maelstrom against the IJN warships, but the Chinese left flank basically was left out of action. Now, Admiral Ding aboard the flagship Jingyuan alongside her sister Jinyuan went straight forward against the IJN center, hoping to tussle the most while the rest of the Beiyang fleet maneuvered around to avoid hits. In one source I was reading, they tell a tale that the initial firing at Jing Yuan's main battery was aimed directly forward and thus literally destroyed her own flying bridge. End quote. Thereby demolishing the temporary flying bridge on which Admiral Ding was standing. Ding's leg was crushed, so he could not stand, let alone walk, during the hostilities. This made it impossible for him to repeat his order in time. The wounds would also make it difficult for him to follow the battle. However, as pointed out by Philo McGiffin in his memoirs, Ding was merely catapulted by the shockwave of the guns going off. Historians have come to the consensus today that the flying bridge was hit by the Japanese, and Admiral Ding's poor legs were crushed as a result of their gunfire to do it, alongside countless officers who were killed and injured. The Jing Yuan opened fire at 5,000 meters, which was ridiculously too far to cause damage to the Japanese ships. As soon as the Jing Yuan opened fire, the rest of the Qing warships followed suit, wasting countless precious shells, firing way too far out of range to possibly hit the Japanese warships. According to Vice Admiral G.A. Ballard of the British Navy, the Qing formation doomed her from the very beginning, as the line abreast strategy required the strongest ships, not the weakest, to be on the wings in order to prevent the weaker ships from being picked off, which the Japanese would do. The Qing also failed to change course in such a way as to prevent the Japanese from going around their wing, allowing their vessels to deliver full broadside gunfire at closer range. The Japanese had held their fire for a full 20 minutes as they simply headed diagonally across the Beiyang fleet, going twice their speed. On the signal of Admiral Ito, the Japanese squadrons divided, with the flying squadron led by Tsuboi ramping from 8 knots to 14 knots, heading for the center of the Qing formation. The Qing were very confused by this sudden bull rush towards them, but then Tsuboi's formation turned slightly to port, moving around the right flank of the Chinese formation, as they began to open fire on the weakest units from the effective range of 3,000 meters or less. The Japanese gunfire first battered the Chaoyang and Yangwei, as Tsuboi steered his squadron northward to engage the Qing reinforcements coming from the Yalu River. This was the Pingyuan group. Meanwhile, the IJN main squadron followed the same course direction as the flying, but to the Chinese left flank, making a full turn around them to circle behind and hit their rear. However, their slowest ships, the Fuso and Heiwei, instead came into a shorter range and boldly steered right between two Qing battleships, passing through their line, receiving the returning fire as they did. They would join their main squadron coming out on the opposite side. Unfortunately for the Akagi, she broke through the Chinese lines towards the left and its center and came across 3 Qing warships to her stern, just within 800 meters. Akagi was hit with a shell to her bridge, which killed her captain and several others. Her forward magazine was destroyed, and she tried to speed up to avoid some more hits. Over in the flying squadron, the Yoshino could see the peril of the Heiwei and the Akagi, so instead of leading down the enemy's rear, she changed course more to starboard to come to their rescue, wedging herself between the enemy and the Akagi. As Yoshino did this, she poured shells from her broadsides upon the enemy, and now the Chinese right wing was enveloped between 2 fires. The flying squadron was now turning with starboard helm, passing a second time entirely around the Chinese right flank. The Heiwei and Akagi signaled their damage and received permission to retire out of action. 3 Qing warships, the Laiyuan, Xieyuan, and Guangqi, tried to pursue the Heiwei and Akagi, but despite their damage, they managed to outpace them and returned fire from a distance. The Jiyuan returned to the battle, the Laiyuan received too much damage and had to be taken out of action, and the Guangqi simply fled. In the center and right of Admiral Ding's fleet, the gun battle was raging. The admiral had been wounded 20 minutes into the fight. Because of his injury, Commodore Liu Tai-Tai-sen had to take command of the fleet. All 4 of Jing Yuan's heavy guns were knocked out by IJN quick-firing guns early into the fight. Thus, she was reduced to using just her 6-inch guns. The Yangwei and Chaoyang, who were stuck on the very outside of the right flank, received the initial hellstorm from the Japanese as they passed by. Both ships were battered early and unable to fire back. The Chaoyang was ablaze and ran aground over a large rock, while the Yangwei, also ablaze, beached herself to save herself. The Chaoyang was last seen settling after before sinking, with her upper mast remaining above the surface. The Qiyuan was forced to retire early as all 3 of her gun carriages were hit by the IJN quick-firing guns. The Beiyang fleet as a whole was caught between the two Aegean squadrons who were unleashing their broadsides upon them to devastating effect. The Qing were evidently tossed into a state of chaos, with some ships fleeing, others dueling, and some sinking already. The Japanese kept up their column formation, making circles around the enemy. They would make 3 full circles during the battle. After some time, the Ding Yuan attempted to close in on her enemy, and to the Japanese it looked like she was trying to ram one of them. She broke the formation with 3 other ships charging at full speed. Admiral Ito reported in his action report this: that at 2:30, the Jing Yuan steamed past the front of his squadron, but she received such a storm of projectiles that her crew seemed to fall into a state of the greatest confusion, and presently she took fire. The Jing Yuan was battered so badly, she tried to flee at the last moment, but the Japanese flying squadron chased her down, battering her until she sank. It is said her gunners kept returning fire until she was under the waves. At 3:20, the severely damaged and burning Ji Yuan had returned to the fight after chasing the Akagi and attempted to ram the Naniwa or Yoshino, depending on what source you read. But nonetheless, she would be shot upon until she sank, and in the process, it took with her Captain Deng Xicheng. Captain Deng Xicheng was one of their greatest commanders, and he spent some time overseas evaluating foreign fleets. His loss was a grave one. At 3:30, the 2 flagships were in close range, and the Matsushima's main turret was hit by a 12-inch shell. There was not great damage, but fires began all over her deck. Another shell hit Matsushima's forward 4.7-inch rapid-firing gun, killing some men and hurtling the turret across the ship violently. The Japanese flagship had been the target of many of the Qing warships from the very offset of the battle, and received numerous hits. Her commander and the first lieutenant were killed alongside 120 men. Admiral Ito was forced to transfer his flag over to the Hashidate. Also at 3:30, firing ceased on both sides as many were putting out massive fires. It took around an hour for the gun duels to really pick up again. 5 Aegean warships of the main squadron were fighting back and forth with 2 Qing battleships until around 6 p.m. The Jing Yuan and Jian Yuan were able to resist the punishment because of their heavy armor, but all of the sailors on deck were decimated by shells and fragments going everywhere. When the Qing opened fire upon the Japanese, as they passed from port to starboard, they failed to score any significant hits using their 12-inch and 8.2-inch guns. The 2 Aegean squadrons had made full circles of the Beiyang fleet, using the quick-firing guns, smashing the Qing warship superstructures and sweeping their decks with carnage. During the melee, quite a few of the Aegean warships received devastating hits as well. The Yoshino, Akagi, and Sakyo-Amaru were put out of action from sustained hits. The Heioi, who was a much slower ship than the rest, received severe damage, and it did not help that her captain had decided not to follow the flying squadron's sweep maneuver, but instead passed directly through the Qing line. This poor decision made the Heioi a very easy target as she ran through a gauntlet of Qing warships. By late afternoon, the Beiyang fleet was tipping to the point of collapse. Many warships had literally fled for their lives or had been sunk. The Ding Yuan and Jian Yuan were nearly out of ammunition. Aboard the Ding Yuan, Admiral Ding was pretty much out of commission as well, and their foremast was destroyed, making it impossible to signal to the rest of the fleet. The rest of the Qing ships began forming up in pairs of 3 to mutually support another in the duels. When the Japanese had begun firing, the Ji Yuan turned to flee from the offset, and upon seeing this, the Guangjia joined in. The Ji Yuan was hit once, and as for the Guangjia, she had quickly become lost and ran aground, forced to scuttle by her crew later on. There was also claims that Ji Yuan may have collided with the Yangwei, causing her to sink in the process. The Sakyo-Amaru tried to finish off the Yangwei, which managed to beach herself. The Sakyo-Amaru got roughly handled from the very beginning of the fight. She had first opened fire from a very long range, but then got close in to the Qing ironclads. After an hour of combat, her steering gear got damaged, sending her sailing off uncoordinated. Upon seeing her in distress, the Ping Yuan tried to hunt her down with some torpedo boats. Torpedoes were fired at the Sakyo-Amaru, but they all missed, with some getting as close as 40 to 50 yards of her. The Sakyo-Amaru fled for her life, and she would escape. The better-trained, better-maintained Aegean rapid-firing guns simply outperformed the Chinese, who had limited ammunition, ill-maintained equipment, less gunnery training, and well, when you find out that some of your shells have cement or porcelain in them, I would say they were demoralized as well. While the Japanese were certainly scoring better and more significant hits, this did not mean the Qing were not fighting for their lives, however. The Qing warships continued to fire everything that they had. The Liuyuan, despite being a burning wreck, continued to fire upon the enemy to the very bitter end. The primary armaments of the Qing battleships fired 197 rounds, scoring around 10 hits. While this is extremely low, when they did hit, they knocked out the Japanese flagship from the battle. But unfortunately for the Chinese, they were unable to deliver killing blows. Overall, the Beiyang fleet scored about 10% of their hits, and the Japanese scored roughly 15%. But do take into consideration the Japanese were firing at a rate 3 times higher to that of the Chinese. When night was coming upon them, Admiral Ding gathered the remnants of his Beiyang fleet and they steered off towards Port Arthur. The Japanese had 4 ships severely damaged, with some light damage to 2. The Japanese had around 180 deaths, 200 wounded. The flagship Matsushima suffered the worst amount of casualties at around 100, after receiving a 12-inch shell. The Heiwa would have to be retired from combat because of her injuries. Akagi lost many men and required repairs. The Sakyomaru, which was not really a warship, in reality she was a converted liner, had lacked offensive armament, but she came into the fray nonetheless, and she was hit by 4 12-inch shells which knocked out her steering, sending her wandering off for quite some time. The Beiyang fleet had lost the Qiyuan, Yangwei, Guangqi, Chaoyang, and the Jingyuan, and had over 850 deaths and 500 wounded. Dingyuan was reported to have been hit by no less than 200 hits, but her thick armor protected her from serious damage. The deepest dents were found to be around 3 inches. Her upper deck was completely destroyed by fire. 2 secondary battery guns were disabled, all of her signal halyards were shot away, but her engines were in perfect working order. The Jianyuan was hit approximately 120 times, but her injuries proved worse than her sister. Her main battery was crippled, and when she made it to the anchorage, she was nearly sinking. The Liuyuan suffered most from fire damage. She had to be gutted fore and after with the deck and bulkheads about her magazines being found red hot. The Pingyuan, according to Admiral Ito's report, suffered horribly from fires as well, but she took little part in the actual fighting. Of the entire fleet, only 3 Qing warships escaped without serious injury: the Jingyuan, Qiyuan, and the Guangbing. The Yantai correspondent of the Shanghai-based newspaper, the China Gazette, had this to say after the battle. "There is no doubt the Chinese fought bravely, but they were no match for the Japanese, whose tactics were admirable throughout the fight. The unfortunate Chinese gunners lost their heads and fired wildly. Their officers left their ships at the mercy of the enemy by their clumsy seamanship, while, on the other hand, almost every shot of the Japanese told." A reporter for the Japanese Weekly Mail had this to say. "The Japanese men of war preserved their battle array intact from first to last, but the Chinese were soon compelled to fight without any tactical order." The New York Times ran this as a headline. "China's Waterloo in Korea, Japan's great naval victory." After the battle, the Japanese discovered to their intense interest that some of the Chinese shells were filled with cement instead of explosives. They also reported finding some ammunition filled with porcelain, others being the wrong caliber for the guns on the ship it was found on. It seemed to the Japanese military leadership they had grossly underestimated the degree of corruption and incompetence within the Qing dynasty. Admiral Ito chose not to pursue the fleeing Beiyang fleet because he knew his fleet lacked weapons capable of sinking the 2 ironclad battleships. Unbeknownst to him, the Beiyang fleet had basically fired all of their ammunition and the 2 battleships were basically sitting ducks. According to Sir Robert Hart, the Inspector General of the Qing Maritime Customs, on the eve of the Battle of the Yalu, he had this to say. "The Chinese had no shells for their Krupp artillery and no powder for their Armstrong guns. These were some of the main offensive weapons of their entire fleet. The IJN would be criticized for not pursuing the Qing later on, but the admirals were making decisions based on the knowledge they held at the time, and that knowledge was that they could not possibly take down those two big battleships. The loss at Pyongyang on land and at Yalu upon the sea were devastating to the Qing and absolutely dazzled foreign presses. It was recognized that after the Battle of the Yalu, it was Japan now who controlled the sea. Meanwhile, the official battle report handed back to the Qing imperial court went like this. The Chinese fleet had defeated a numerically superior fleet of the Woren, sinking 3 of the enemy's ships and severely injuring the rest, but losing 4 of our own in the battle. The Japanese would actually find an official dispatch to Lihanjiang later on in Port Arthur that said this concerning the Battle of the Yalu. More terrible than any to be found in the naval records even of Western countries. The ships of both sides were considerably damaged, especially those of the enemy. The enemy retired first, so that victory may more or less be said to have rested upon us. Had not our rear become disordered, the entire victory would have been ours. The dispatch also went on to recommend rewards for those who fought so bravely at the Yalu. I would like to take this time to remind all of you that this podcast is only made possible through the efforts of Kings and Generals over at YouTube. Please go subscribe to Kings and Generals over at YouTube and continue to help us produce this content by checking out www.patreon.com/kingsandgenerals. And hey, don't forget about our sister podcast over at the Pacific War Week by Week podcast, written and narrated by me. And if after all of that you are still hungry for some more history, why don't you check out my personal channel, the Pacific War channel over at YouTube. And over there you can find a 2-parter I did on the First Sino-Japanese War, where I covered the Battle of the Yalu in depth, and there's a lot of visuals and even cinematic stuff to give it some flavor. Also, just a friendly reminder, I myself now have a Patreon account, which can be found at www.patreon.com/thepacificwarchannel. And this month's exclusive podcast over there is part 3 of my series about General Ishiwara Kanji, the mastermind behind the Mukden incident and the author of the Final War Theory. Please check it out, it would mean a lot to me. While the Beiyang fleet had the bigger ships, bigger guns, and more armor, the Japanese had managed to defeat them because of better training, better maintenance, and well, having ammunition seemed to be an important variable as well.